What if the most important battle of the Pacific wasn't a battle at all? What if it was a desperate one-way mission that inflicted almost no real damage, but so terrified the Japanese high command that it forced them into a fatal error? An error that would cost them the entire war. In the first dark months of 1942, America was losing. The nation was still reeling, stunned and angry from the blow at Pearl Harbor. In the streets, there was grim determination, but in the halls of Washington, there was a quiet fear. The Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable. Admiral Yamamoto's octopus, as he called it, was stretching its tentacles across the Pacific. The Philippines were falling. Malaya and Singapore, the very symbols of British power in the East, were collapsing. The seemingly invincible Japanese Army and Navy were sweeping south, capturing Manila, Hong Kong, and the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. American battleships lay twisted and broken in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales were at the bottom of the South China Sea. For the Allies, it was a season of disaster. President Roosevelt knew this. He knew the American people needed more than just grim resolve. They needed hope. They needed to see that we could hit back. But how? The enemy was thousands of miles away, protected by airing of conquered islands and the most powerful carrier fleet in the world. Any conventional attack was impossible, so a new, unconventional plan was born. A plan so audacious, so dangerous that many in the high command considered it suicidal. The plan was to do what the Japanese believed could never be done, to bomb Tokyo itself. But there was a problem. No American airfield was in range. The only way to get bombers close enough was on an aircraft carrier. This presented a second, even greater problem. The bombers they needed, B-25 Mitchells, were medium bombers. They were designed to take off from long paved runways, not from the pitching deck of a ship. And even if they could take off, they could never land back on it. It would be a one-way trip. 16 B-25s and their crews, led by the legendary airman Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, were loaded onto the deck of the USS Hornet. These 80 men were all volunteers. They knew the stakes. They would have to launch, fly blind over hundreds of miles of ocean, find their targets in Japan, and then, with whatever fuel they had left, try to make it to friendly airfields in China. They were told to expect to ditch their planes and fight alongside Chinese guerrillas. On April 18, 1942, far earlier than planned, the Hornet and its task force were spotted by a Japanese patrol boat. The element of surprise was lost. Doolittle had a choice: abort the mission or launch immediately, hundreds of miles farther from Japan than they had ever practiced. He chose to launch. One by one, those 16 bombers wrestled themselves into the air, clearing the deck with only feet to spare. They flew low, skimming the waves to avoid detection for hours. Then they saw the coastline of Japan, the impossible wash happening. Air raid sirens wailed over Tokyo for the first time in its history. Japanese civilians who had been told 4 months that their homeland was sacred and untouchable ran for cover as American bombs fell on the capital. The physical damage was minimal. A few factories hit, some civilian buildings. It was a pinprick. But the psychological damage was catastrophic. The Doolittle Raid, more than any other single event, changed the mind of one man, Admiral Yamamoto. This single raid shocked the Japanese Empire to its core, and in doing so sealed its fate. For months, Yamamoto had been the Yamamoto's great fear voice of caution in the Japanese high command. While military nationalists in Tokyo celebrated their string of glorious victories, Yamamoto was worried. He had studied in America. He had served as the naval attaché in Washington. He knew better than anyone the sheer industrial power he had awakened. He famously warned the politicians, "I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year and a half, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." He knew Japan could not win a long war of attrition. His entire strategy, starting with Pearl Harbor, was to inflict a series of shocking, devastating blows to American morale and force them to negotiate a peace. He believed that once Singapore fell, the British would be ready to talk. He believed the Americans were, as the propaganda said, too soft to fight a bloody war to the finish. But the Doolittle Raid proved him wrong. The Americans were not soft. They were not demoralized. They were angry. And they were willing to sacrifice 80 of their best men just to send a message. Suddenly, Yamamoto was in a desperate political position. The raid had been launched from an aircraft carrier. His primary failure at Pearl Harbor was not sinking the battleships. It was letting the American carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Lexington escape. Those carriers were still out there. They had just proven they could strike the Emperor's homeland. For the Japanese military, this was an unbearable dishonor. The army and the public alike were now demanding that the Navy do its job and eliminate the threat. Yamamoto's cautious timeline was shattered. He had to act, and he had to act now. His window for a negotiated peace was closing fast, so he pushed forward his master plan, the one he believed would end the war in a single decisive battle. It was designated the MI Plan, the target Midway Island. Yamamoto's logic was simple. Midway was a tiny, vital American base just northwest of Hawaii. If he attacked it, he knew the American carriers would have no choice but to sail out and defend it. And this time, he would be waiting. He would bring the full, overwhelming might of the combined fleet, carriers, battleships, cruisers, and annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet once and for all. With the carriers gone, America would have no way to project power in the Pacific, and they would be forced to the negotiating table. The Doolittle Raid had turned a strategic option into an urgent necessity. But Yamamoto, for all his genius, was not the only one making plans. The Imperial General Staff in Tokyo, particularly the Army, had their own ambitions. They were less concerned with the American carriers and more concerned with the Australia plan. They wanted to keep pushing south to invade New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Their goal was to cut off Australia from the United States, depriving the Americans of their last forward base. This created a fatal division of resources. While Yamamoto was gathering his fleet for the decisive battle at Midway, then Naval General Staff was moving pressure ships and planes south to Rabaul in the Solomon Islands, preparing to choke off Australia. Japan was now trying to fight two major campaigns at once, stretching its octopus thin, just as Yamamoto had feared. In June 1942, the Midway, the fatal division operation, flamed into disaster. Thanks to American code reekers who had anticipated the attack, Admiral Yamamoto was able to set his own trap. In Theskies over Midway, the Japanese Navy received its second great shock. In the span of just 5 minutes, American dive bombers mortally wounded 3 of Japan's finest fleet carriers. A fourth was sunk hours later. These were Thevry carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The elite, irreplaceable pilots who had dominated the skies for 6 months were now gone, lost in the inferno. The news was so devastating that it was suppressed. The Japanese public was told Midway was a great victory. Even the Japanese army was not told the full extent of the loss. But Yamamoto knew the backbone of his navy was broken. His plan for a short, victorious war was over, and yet the other war, the push south, continued. Even with the carrier fleet crippled, the forces in the South Pacific pressed on. They had taken Rabaul in January and built it into a fortress. They had taken Tulagi and built a seaplane base. And now, American reconnaissance planes began spotting something new. Something deeply alarming. On a nearby jungle-covered island nobody had ever heard of, Guadalcanal, an airfield. The Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. From that field, their bombers could strike the American supply lines to Australia, effectively cutting the continent off without a costly invasion. What the Doolittle Raid had started and Midway had accelerated was now coming to a head. The war was no longer about a decisive battle in the middle of the ocean. It was about a patch of dirt and palm trees in the Solomon Islands. In Washington, the strategic map was redrawn overnight. The Germany First policy was still in effect, but the threat from Guadalcanal was too immediate to ignore. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, however, were paralyzed by a feud that seems unbelievable today. Who would command the operation? General Douglas MacArthur, having escaped the Philippines, was now in Australia commanding the Southwest Pacific area. He insisted the operation was his, but Admiral Ernest J. King, the tough, abrasive chief of naval operations, refused. King despised MacArthur. He believed this was a naval campaign and he was not about to hand his precious carriers and Marines over to an army general. After bitter arguments, a compromise was struck. The Joint Chiefs drew a line on the map. The operation would have 2 phases. Phase 1, the capture of Tulagi, and the adjacent positions, which included the anonymous Guadalcanal, would be run by the Navy. Under Admiral King. After that, Phase 2, the capture of Rabaul and the rest off New Guinea, would be handed over to General MacArthur. It was a messy political solution, and it would have deadly consequences. The man tapped to Operation Shoestring lead the invasion was Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley. He was a good man, but he was overwhelmed. When he arrived in New Zealand to take command, he was filled with gloomy thoughts. He didn't have the ships. He didn't have the supplies. And his men had no training. This whole thing was being rushed, and it got worse. The command structure was a nightmare. Gormley in New Zealand was an overall command, but the carrier task force, the all-important air cover, was commanded by Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The amphibious force, the transports and warships carrying the Marines, was commanded by the aggressive Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, and the Marines themselves were led by General Alexander Vandergrift. It was a committee, and the men on it did not trust each other. Fletcher in particular was gun-shy. He had lost the Lexington at the Coral Sea and the Yorktown at Midway. He was now down to the Saratoga, Wasp, and Enterprise, and he was terrified of losing them. He viewed the carriers as his to protect, not Gormley's to risk. This tension boiled over during the single disastrous rehearsal for the invasion staged at Kororo Island near Fiji. It was a complete bust. Only a third of the troops managed to get ashore. Landing craft ran into each other. Supplies were loaded in the wrong order. General Vandergrift called it a total failure, but there was no time to fix it. On July 31st, the Marines were loaded back onto their transports and the invasion fleet steamed north. At a tense final meeting aboard the Saratoga, Admiral Fletcher dropped a bombshell. He announced to Turner and Vandergrift that he would only provide air cover for the landing for only 2 days. He insisted the risk from Japanese land-based bombers was too great, and he would not sacrifice his carriers. Admiral Turner was furious. He knew it would take at least 4 or 5 days to unload all the Marina's supplies, ammunition, and heavy equipment. Fletcher withdrawing in 2 days meant leaving the Marines stranded, blind, and defenseless on an island full of Japanese. But Fletcher was the senior officer, and his mind was made up. This was Operation Shoestring, an invasion launched on a prayer, plagued by infighting, and led by a commander who was already planning his exit before the first shot was fired. As the 75 ships of the American task force slipped through the rain squalls on the night of August 6th, they were sailing into history completely undetected. Japanese intelligence, so brilliant just months before, had failed. Their attention was fixed on New Guinea, where their own troops were pushing toward Port Moresby. They had no inkling that the soft Americans were about to launch the first major amphibious offensive of the war. At dawn on August 7, 1942, the sky cleared. The Marines on deck looked out at the high jungle green mountains of Guadalcanal. At 6:12 a.m., the American cruisers and destroyers opened fire. The world exploded in flashes of light. The bombardment set oil dumps blazing along the shore, sending thick black smoke leaping into the sky. On Tulagi, a frantic Japanese radio operator sent the last message the base would ever send. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The Doolittle Raid had been America's desperate cry of defiance. This was the answer. The landing in the ghost town, the invasion plan was twofold. The main force, 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division, would land on Guadalcanal and seize the airfield. A smaller separate force, the elite 1st Marine Raider Battalion under Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, would simultaneously assault the nearby island of Tulagi along with the tiny adjoining islands of Kavutu and Tanamogo. On Guadalcanal, the landing was ridiculously easy. The Marines splashed ashore at 9 a.m. and met no assistance at all. The Japanese on the island were almost entirely construction troops and laborers. When the shells started falling, they had simply dropped everything and fled into the jungle. The Marines walked into a ghost town. They found barracks that had never been slept in. They found a breakfast table full of platters of meat, rice, and cooked plums with half-filled rice bowls scattered on the floor. Chopsticks were dropped mid-meal. The enemy had been taken by complete surprise. The Marines, who had been told to expect 70% casualties, began to develop a dangerous contempt for the enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine told a correspondent. "All they do is run." He would soon get his wish. Because across the channel on Tagi, Edson's raiders were finding out what a real fight looked like. Tulagi was a different story. It was defended by 250 men of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment. These were not laborers. They were seasoned, dedicated naval troops, and they were dug in. Edson's men landed at 8:15 a.m. At first, the terrain seemed the worst obstacle. The jungle was a tangled mat of vines and sharp bougainvillea. It took the Marines 3 hours to chop their way just a mile and a half up to the main ridge line, and that's when they hit the Japanese central defenses. The Japanese had built dugouts and rock embrassers perfectly sited for interlocking fields of fire. They were dug into the steep slopes of a 3-sided ravine with an old British cricket field at the bottom. As the Marines moved up, they were hit by a vicious crossfire. This was the first test of the war, America's best against Japan's best. The raiders learned new brutal tactics on the fly. They found that by crawling up the cliffs, they could get above the dugouts and drop charges of dynamite and grenades inside. But even then, the positions weren't safe. In one hole, after killing 17 Japanese with dynamite, a Marine went in to retrieve a radio. 2 wounded soldiers playing dead shot him and the man who came to help him before they were finally killed. The fighting on the adjoining islands of Gavutu and Tanamogo was even worse. The 500 Japanese defenders there had fortified the small hills, and every position had to be taken by hand. The Japanese swarmed the first American tanks that landed, jamming crowbars in their treads, trying to set them on fire with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened his hatch to use his machine gun and killed 23 Japanese before one scrambled up the side and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. This was a kind of war the Americans had never seen. The Japanese suicidal attitude was a shock. Wounded men with no hope of survival would pretend to surrender only to pull out a grenade to kill themselves and their captors. In a brutal New Waron dugout, 3 Japanese officers, cornered and out of ammunition, were found with 3 bodies and 1 empty pistol. One officer had shot his 2 companions and then himself. After seeing this, the Marines stopped asking for surrender. By the end of the second day, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanamogo were secured. The cost 122 killed and 203 wounded Marine casualties. The 886-man Japanese garrison was nearly wiped out with only 23 captured. While this savage battle raged on Tulagi, the Japanese at Rabaul were recovering from the shock. At 8:30 a.m. on the first day, 27 Betty bombers escorted by 18 Zero fighters took off from Rabaul. They had been loaded for strike on New Guinea. Now they were diverted to Guadalcanal. An Australian coast watcher on Bougainville Island, part of a network of brave planters and officials who hid in the jungle, spotted the formation. He radioed the warning, 24 bombers heading yours. That message relayed through Pearl Harbor gave the American fleet 2 hours to prepare. When the Japanese planes arrived, the sky was full of F-4F Wildcat fighters from Fletcher's carriers. The Americans tore into the bombers with their Zero escorts engaged in dogfights elsewhere. The Japanese bomber pilots were massacred. All but 10 of the 24 bombers were shot down. The destroyer Mugford was hit, but the transports were safe. It was a victory, but a costly one. The American F-4F Wildcat was a good plane. It was armored and sturdy. It could take a beating. But the Japanese Zero was a revelation. It was faster, more maneuverable, and had a better rate of climb. The Zeros flew rings around the Wildcats. In that first day of air combat, the Americans learned to never ever try to dogfight a Zero. The only way to survive was to dive on them, fire a burst, and then run. By nightfall on August 8th, Admiral Fletcher had lost 21 of his 99 fighters. For Fletcher, this was the last straw. His losses were 20%. His pilots were exhausted. He was convinced Japanese air power from Rabaul would only increase. At 6:00 p.m. on the second day of the invasion, he sent a dispatch to Admiral Gormley. He was withdrawing his carriers. He didn't even wait for air ply. Before Gormley could protest, Fletcher's task force was steaming south away from Guadalcanal. When Admiral Turner, still frantically trying to unload supplies at the beachhead, intercepted Fletcher's message, he realized the catastrophic position he was in. The transports filled with Therist of the Marines food, ammunition, medical supplies, and heavy artillery were now sitting ducks. They had no air cover. The Marines on shore, who had just captured the airfield, had no way to defend it. General Vandergrift, upon hearing the news, was blunt. It put him in the most serious position, but there was nothing he could do. Turner made the only decision he could. He would pull the transports out the very next morning. The Marines of the 1st Division, 11,000 strong, would be left behind with only the supplies they had managed to dump on the beach in 48 hours. The Doolittle Raid had forced Japan's hand at Midway. The defeat at Midway had forced America's hand at Guadalcanal, and now the timidity of one admiral was about to set the stage for one of the worst naval disasters in American history. As darkness fell on abandoned August 8th, the exhausted American and Australian sailors guarding the transports settled in for the night. They believed the worst was over. They were wrong, because while Admiral Fletcher was running south, a new powerful Japanese force was already speeding toward them undetected. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul, was not an airman. He was a surface warfare expert. When he heard of the invasion, he had immediately gathered every warship he could find. 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. He knew he had no air cover, but he also knew the Americans were incompetent at night fighting, while his own men had trained for it obsessively. He would use the darkness as his weapon. His plan was simple: steam down the slot, that dark channel between the islands. At full speed, arrive after midnight, and annihilate the American screening force. Through a series of tragic errors, a lost message, a gap in air searches, a failure of command, Mikawa's force was never spotted. As the American sailors dozed at their posts, 8 Japanese warships slipped past the lone destroyer picket, rounded Savo Island, and entered the channel where the Allied cruisers were guarding the helpless transports. In Tokyo, the shame of the Doolittle Raid had demanded a victory. At Midway, that victory had turned to ash. Now, in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, Admiral Mikawa was about to get his revenge. The fight for Guadalcanal had only just begun. If you found this look into the mechanics of the Pacific War valuable, a subscription to this channel is the best way to ensure you don't miss our next chapter. We rely on viewers like you to keep this history alive. The history of what happened next in the battle that became known as the Battle of Savo Island is one of the most harrowing and controversial in U.S. Navy history. It serves as a brutal lesson in readiness, and it's a story we'll be covering in detail very soon. But the chain of events is what's so critical. From the desperation in Washington, to the courage of Doolittle's men, to the shock in Tokyo, to the fatal gamble at Midway, every event was linked. A chain reaction of pride, fear, and desperation that led both navies to that one stretch of water. This is history, not as a list of dates, but as a story of human decisions. If you'd like to see more deep dives like this one, our full library of battles is available on our channel page. For those who want to continue exploring the Pacific War, we recommend starting with our video on the Battle of the Coral Sea, which you can find in the comments below. Thank you for joining us and remembering the deeds of a generation that truly saved the world.